Hi, it's Frank, and I'm once again talking about voice leading. Today I'm offering up some 2- and 3-note examples of voice leading. So the idea of voice leading, of course, has to do with voices, even if you're playing an instrument. So what you'll find on the PDF that's linked in the description is that I have across the first 2 examples used just 2 notes, 2 voices, and then in the third example, 3 voices, the triad. The goal here is to get comfortable with this idea of noticing what individual notes are doing as you're moving them around. This is especially helpful when you're working with chord melody stuff, which is what the ultimate aim of using all this material is for. So in the first 8 measures, actually with all the examples here, I used 8 measures of chord progression from the song Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. This is the part that's behind the singing, not the part of the intro, just to be clear. These 8 measures are a great example of diatonic chord movements, in this case in the key of G, that don't adhere to the usual kind of progressions that are expected, meaning the 1-6-2-5s or 1-4-5 or any of the other progressions that I've talked about. As I've said before, you don't have to adhere to those progressions wholesale in order to make something viable or interesting. In fact, breaking some of those conventions is often what leads to really neat stuff. And that's actually what's going on here. The most noticeable thing I would say right off the bat in this particular 8-measure combination of chords is the fact that 2 chord always goes right back to 1. It never actually moves through 5 first. It just actually goes from 2 right to 1. So just to dive right in to the PDF, the first 8 measures are laid out in such a way where I used a root position consisting of 2 voices, as I said, and that's always the root on the bottom and the third on top. Just at a glance, by looking over those notes, you'll see that there can be a lot more skips involved. For instance, in the first measure to the second measure, that motion is by step. To be clear, one letter of the alphabet to the one right after or right before it. That's what I'm talking about when I say step. Not really thinking specifically about whole and half steps. For our purposes at the moment, that's going to be the same thing. As long as you're on C and you go to either D or B, that's a stepwise motion. So that's what we see in the first 2 measures. But then as we go from the second to third measure, notice there's a movement from the D chord to A minor, where to keep things in root position, we skip a 4th. That's much more noticeable. Is it wrong? No, it's not. Certain conventions in part writing might tell you that that's wrong. That is to say, if we were to go back to the mid-17th century, when this sort of thing started to evolve as a result of guys like Johann Sebastian Bach, for instance, and the so-called 4-voice texture that is commonly thought of when we talk about voice leading and part writing, certain conventions would have to be avoided, certain conventions would have to be used. I'm not getting that strict with what I'm talking about today, just to be very clear. This is not some sort of video on specifically writing in a Baroque style. What we're talking about is the kind of voice leading that allows us to keep chord movements smooth. And for our purposes, the governing aspect of that is how much we're moving around and at what point we want that movement to be more noticeable or less noticeable. In general terms, we generally want the voice leading to be in a way that it's less noticeable, the movement of the chords. So as I said, this is kind of an example as you go from the second to third measure of how it stands out more because of that distance. There's also another example that's kind of similar to that if you get to the second line of this page where you go from the C chord to the A minor chord. Notice here we are moving by a third in each voice. That is to say, the C and E in the 6th measure go to A and C in the 7th measure. Again, that's not as big as a 4th, it's a smaller distance, but it's noticeable. The other thing that's noticeable is that the voices are all moving in the same direction at the same time. Generally, there's 3 kinds of movement we think about when we talk about this type of thing, and this is true regardless of whether you adhere to older rules or not. There's direct or similar motion, where 2 or more voices move in the same direction at the same time. There's contrary motion, where voices move in opposition to one another. And there's so-called oblique motion. Oblique is where at least one voice does not move, so the voices around it do, however many there are. In the second example on this page, page 1, this starts there in measure 9 and runs to the end then. What I've done is taken roots and thirds again, but this time I've allowed myself to make the lowest note a third of the chord that I'm on instead of just the root. Notice doing that immediately opens up some space between the notes, which is also something to keep in mind when we're talking about building chord melody type stuff or arranging in general. Sometimes you want more space between the notes and not just having them voiced closely together like they are in the first 8 measures. But also there's a little less jumping around even when I do move. Case in point, if you look at the second measure of the second example where the D chord goes to the A minor chord, the lower voice actually moves up from F sharp to A. Now notice it skips the tonic. F sharp in this key is the leading tone. Normally you would want to head because it's a tendency tone, head toward the actual tonic note. But there is no G note in the chord A minor. So here again, you have to make allowances for movement of notes based on the chords you're using. But in that same two-measure example, the D chord to A minor, the high voice, which is on D, moves down by step to C. So not only is there contrary motion, one voice goes down, one goes up, but there's a little bit of skip there that's offset by the fact the voices are moving a little more independently. Depending on what you're trying to arrange, sometimes you want to make those voices appear like they're all moving independently. In general, that's what you're listening for in music, even if you don't realize it. The more independence there is in voice movement, even between chords, just from chord to chord, the more interesting it sounds. That's why we're so careful with voice leading. The bottom of the page there, beginning just after where the measure 13 is. So this would be, again, where the C chord goes to an A minor chord, measures 14, 15 by page number, by measure number. We see that E note in the lowest voice of the C, that's the third of that chord, it actually jumps up a fourth to get to the A, which is the root of the next chord. I mentioned in a previous video how it's not at all uncommon to have movement upward of a fourth from the root of a 5 chord to the root of a 1 chord, for example. Here, we don't have the root motion that I just described. As I said, E is the third of C. But that movement of a fourth is a skip. And it's noteworthy for that reason alone. Notice that at the same time, the voice above that, meaning that's happening in the lowest voice of those two chords, in the higher voice, the note isn't moving at all. It's staying in C. That kind of continuity helps even out skips, that is to say, not moving a voice in this case, especially when you consider there's only two voices that are moving overall. So that's the kind of thing we're going for. If we're going to be doing some skipping around and we want it to be noticeable perhaps in a voice, a lower voice or higher voice, then something else probably shouldn't move or should move very little, meaning a step at most. On the next page, we have the final example. Again, all three of these using the same series of chords in the same order, but here I've opened things up to triads. And the first thing you notice if you step back and look at everything that's going on there is that the triads are descending. They're all, in fact, moving downward. Turns out, with one exception, as highlighted in the red notes there in the first two measures of that example, everything is moving by step. Is that good? Yeah, in a sense, but is it great? Not necessarily, and this is where you start to get into the distinction of understanding how to use these kind of so-called rules or guidelines, better word I guess, while also balancing that against what you're trying to make sound happen. Meaning, do you want there to be something very tense at this moment, and in doing a skip, would you get that? Or do you want everything just descending in a nice, neat, orderly fashion? Which is exactly what you get in that example there on the second page, by the way. It's all very smooth sounding because, again, everything's moving downward in the same direction, essentially, by a step. Now, in good part writing, going way back to when, one of the first things you get dinged for is this idea that everything should be moving in the same direction constantly, measure after measure. Like I said, we're a little looser with this idea now, but the truth of the matter is it still carries some weight. Because if I just did that kind of thing over and over in my chord melody, no matter what the melody was doing, if I was constantly moving down or constantly moving up, it would get boring. So that's partly why some of those prohibitions developed in the first place, is to avoid things that would detract from the music, elements that would make it sound less musical, less interesting. So it's just something to be aware of, even though, like I say, this final example on page 2 illustrates very smooth movement with minimal skipping around. It's maybe not as super exciting as it could be. This is, however, a good way to start familiarizing yourself with using some of the other elements talked about, common tones and tendency tones, because as you notice what's going on in those 8 measures, you'll see that things are being connected a lot through oblique motion, where one voice isn't moving, or in notes that are tendency tones are being resolved in stepwise fashion, even if they're not going to the expected note, meaning the note they have a tendency to move toward. And yet things are still sounding like they're moving along through that progression, meaning the last 8 measures of this PDF that I have. So once again, I just wanted to cover some of these things. I know this isn't a great deal of detail. If you're into part writing, you already know something about arranging in this way. You know that I've left a lot out. But this does get us onto the next stage of what I wanted to talk about, leading up towards actually creating some chord melody and harmonizing a melody. And that is this idea that when you've got multiple notes going around, 2 or 3 voices in particular, and of course with chords we can even have more, other chords we can have more, but we want to be very aware of where each voice is going, where it's coming from and where it's heading. So take care.